All right, let's do this, guys. Let's disconnect it for a second, and then we'll pop right back on. Maybe it's the something with the connection. Oh, there we go. Denise, was it you? What, you didn't have a button pushed or what?
No, I'm good.
Okay. Is it on now?
There we go. Yep, there we go.
Oh,
Sound now. Thanks, guys.
great, and we said all the important stuff already. So, guys, welcome. Happy Monday. I'm Eric, owner of LEPD Firearms Range and Training Facility, host of On Target Radio Show that we do right here on this studio set on Saturdays at noon on 610 WTVN. I'm here with Dee. She is our training coordinator, director of training, manager of training, does everything training related to get you scheduled in those classes. Our thoughts are this in the last week, or in the last month now, we've had a lot of people buying firearms for their first time. And so last week we put out a little video, just a very basic safety video, some of the things that you can do to make sure you're a safe, responsible firearms owner until you can get in the store and take a class. DM, maybe you should plug in the Mevo too there.
You're
Huh?
thinking ahead today.
I know, somebody has to. So, in lieu of having classes right now, we thought we'd go through different segments each week at around noon on Mondays and take a different topic. This week, Denise is getting a lot of questions concerning, I'm looking for my first firearm. Where do I even begin? And so we wanted to take a step back and help you with a couple things to consider when you're purchasing that first firearm. And certainly this doesn't take the place of coming in here and holding different things and letting us talk to you firsthand and see specifically for you what fits best. But we thought we'd go over a couple of the things that you can start to formulate what might be best for you in purchasing that first handgun for home defense. You ready, Dee? We all up and running?
Yeah, turn
Okay.
the mic on.
So what we decided, there's a couple of things to think about when you're looking for that firearm for home defense. And today we're not talking about CCW. We're not talking about a firearm that you intend to carry in a concealed carry fashion. So right off, whenever a customer comes in and tells us those are some of the parameters they're looking for, it helps us isolate, in our case, where to suggest they start looking. So one of the things that you'll find right off the bat is that you can err on the side of purchasing something a little bit bigger than you would if it was going to be something that you would to conceal. And the reason this comes into play is that when you're looking at a firearm, and today we're just talking about semi-automatics, so revolvers, we're big fans of revolvers, but today we're focusing on that semi-auto. But when you look at what's out there, there's a wide variety. I mean, some of the ones we have sitting here, I mean, you can consider a full-size firearm, and there's really tiny ones as well, more meant for concealed carry. One of the benefits that you have by going to a larger firearm is that the larger the firearm, the more weight behind it, the more able that firearm is to absorb or help absorb some of the recoil that you're going to feel when you shoot the firearm. So for instance, as you can imagine, if you have a round in here and you pull the trigger, because of the weight of this firearm, you're not going to feel the recoil as much as you would have in using a similar round in a very small package. So that's one good thing to consider if you're new to the firearms market and recoil sensitivity is something that you're concerned about. Maybe it's not for you, maybe it's for the family. You're buying one firearm for the whole family and you have a spouse who maybe has some recoil sensitivities. It's not a bad thing to be considering a firearm that's larger. It also helps you with handling it. If you can get your hand around the firearm easier, it helps you with being able to absorb that recoil. The other thing too is that a semi-automatic works on the premise that when the round is fired, it automatically pulls the next round from the magazine and puts it in the chamber. And it does this by the pressures of the round pushing back that slide. Focus in there a little bit. Pushing back the slide and ejecting the one round and pulling the next one up. It only works, though, if you have a good grip on that firearm. So as you fire the firearm, and if that slide goes back and you don't have a good grip and you're putting equal pressure forward, then that slide is not going to go back all the way, and you're going to end up with a firearm that's jammed. And so you will have, in essence, had a firearm that has one shot in that time of need. So the bigger the firearm, the more forgiving it is in those categories. So if you take that same scenario and you have these little tiny ones, it really is not very forgiving. You have to have a good, solid grip on that firearm in order for it to cycle versus some of the larger guns. So keep in mind now, so now we're looking at some of the larger firearms in the case. One of the things you might be saying is, geez, my family has a wide variety of hand sizes. My wife maybe has small hands. Some of the guys out there have large hands versus small hands. How do I, how am I going to pick that one firearm that goes and meets everyone's needs? The neat thing about it is now, when you look at most of the major firearms manufacturers, a lot of them, and this goes for Glocks and Smiths and Springfields and FN as well, a lot of them have the ability to change the size of the grip. So for instance, the Smith & Wesson that we have here, you can see it doesn't take much. Of course, it's a new gun, so it's going to be stiff, and I'm probably going to struggle with it, but it doesn't take much to take that grip off. And then in the box, so they give you a couple different ones. In the box are two other grips. So if your hands are a larger hand, you can put the larger grip in. It goes on real easily. Or if you're a person with the smaller hands, you can go to the smallest of grips and really still have the same functionality of the gun, but really that benefit of making that fit your hand specifically. The other thing, any questions there, Dee?
Someone did want you to go over a hang fire. Can you talk briefly
Sure.
about hang fire?
Yeah, so hang fires, we talked about this a little bit last week too. A hang fire is when you're on the range, you pull the trigger, and nothing happens, or at least you think nothing happens. So, and it can happen even if you have fresh ammunition. It doesn't necessarily have to be with ammunition that's old or reloaded. It can happen really any time. We've seen it over the course of time. Really, I mean, there's no time that that it couldn't occur. And when it happens, your initial reaction was, wow, that round didn't go off. I should, clear it or go to the next round. You need, though, to give it a couple seconds. I think they actually say 30 seconds of keeping that firearm pointed in a safe direction downrange, because, as the name would imply, it can still go off in some cases. It doesn't happen very often, but you don't want it to be that one case where you think that the round didn't go off and you're taking it and you're pointing it in a non-safe direction and then it goes off. So it happens. We get light primer strikes sometimes on some of the rounds. After you give it enough time, if you merely eject that round, and if you look at it, a lot of times the primer will have been hit and the round just didn't go off, and we can dispose of those here at the range for you. Back to choosing the firearm that's right for you. One of the things that we'll ask as well is, do you have any price constraints? And that isn't to upsell you on the most expensive gun here, because that's not always what's the right one for you, but it's to help us look at, within the parameters that we have, what's the best that we can get you for that price. And you don't have to spend $600 or $1,000 on that first firearm. You can get $300-400 and get something that's very reasonable and that it will work well for you. So we might ask you that when we have that discussion with you. Something else too, we talk about caliber. Dee, you've kind of new to the market and stuff.
A range of everything right now.
You do. I mean, and it
especially,
depends on, it depends on if you're going to carry it every day or if it's going to be for home defense. One of the things that we like to point people in the right direction is that if you're buying a firearm for home defense, you are wanting this firearm to stop the action of the bad guy in that time of need. It's safe to say. I mean, that's why you're buying it, is for personal protection. We would be leading you wrong if we didn't go over some of the different pluses and minuses with the different calibers. As you go down the continuum of rounds, and this here is what we use sometimes in our classes, so we can zoom in on that. as we go up and down the continuum of the rounds, the larger the round, the more powder in them, sometimes the more pressures in them, the more speed that round achieves, and the more knockdown power that you get. Hence, stopping the action or at least helping pause the action of the bad guy. So if you can go up the continuum and safely shoot and be accurate with a larger round, you're going to be better off than something on the other side of the continuum that is easier to shoot. As you go up this continuum, there is a lot of times more recoil on the firearm. So if you were to shoot a little 22 versus a 45, you're going to see a difference in how that firearm functions. You're going to feel it more. You can certainly handle it. I mean, we have people of all ages. I mean, you do classes, people of all ages, from the young to the old, and you can handle it. It's all in the training of it. But you want to try to get something that is going to be a efficient stopping power to stop the action. That's what it's all about. And there's trade-offs. So when you look at recoil and you look at stopping power and all of that, it all kind of combines itself into the round itself, the size of the firearm, the size of the person, all that kind of comes into play. Probably by and large, especially nowadays, the most popular round for home defense and for personal protection or personal carry is the 9mm. It's been around for a long time. You have a couple of 9s now, don't you?
Yeah.
And if you purchase a larger firearm in 9mm, you can certainly handle the recoil on those. So let's talk a little bit about some of the safety functions. So you've decided upon a firearm, and I should probably take a step back. When you look at the different brands, people always ask us, what brand do you recommend? It's much like if you stay with the name brands, the Smith & Wessons, the Glocks, the SIGs, the FNs, the ones that you've heard of, you will not be led astray. It's when you start to go off of that, and maybe it's a price issue that's causing you to go to stray from that, is where you start to pick up some of the issues potentially in reliability. Any of the name brands, if you keep them clean and maintenance and well kept, will serve you well for years. You'll be passing them down to the next generation. That's how good these are. I mean, we talked on the show last Saturday about firearms from the turn of the century, from the 1800s to the 1900s, that are still functional today because they've been well maintained. So from a brand standpoint, it comes down to personal preference, and you might have a little bit of cosmetic features on one that you like versus the other, but it really comes down to what fits your hand best and in your personal preference. I mean, I wouldn't any of the major brands are great, and we can talk good about any of them. They're all mechanical. They all will have an issue at some point. I mean, across all the brands. So there's no brand that I can point you to and say you will never have an issue with this. They all, there's a mechanical piece. I mean, we've sent guns back to Glock, Smith, and you name them, all of them at some point.
And it's not always just a gun. Sometimes it's ammo. When
True.
people buy or do any of their own reloads, like sometimes it's the ammo.
It is, and that's a big thing too, and we'll do a show on picking out specific ammo as well. So we've talked a little bit about the brands, about the caliber, about the different size. Let's talk about some of the things about a safety. People we see who are new to the industry, they're a little bit surprised to know that many of these firearms now don't have an external safety. And if you look at law enforcement, if you look at many concealed carry holders, if you look at people who handle firearms for a living, you'll be surprised to know that many don't have a safety on them. And I mean, it's true.
Yeah.
I mean, it's true. And the reason for that is that the thinking that is in a time of need, in a time where this tool is going to protect yourself or your family, you want to make sure that everything is taken out of the mix to prevent you from being successful in that battle. And sometimes, believe it or not, the safety can be something that prevents you unless you practice with that. Practice on the range, practice taking the safety on and off. Unless you do that, then sometimes the safety can be a hindrance. Someone had wrote in on Saturday during the radio show about wanting us to talk a little bit more about dry techniques for dry firing at home, and that's a great thing to practice. If you have a firearm that does have an external safety on it, I mean, practicing at home, drawing that firearm and disengaging that safety, it's a must. It needs to be second nature to do that. So in that time of need, you're not even thinking about it. It's just that it's a something that you do without even giving it second thought. So don't get hung up too much that there's no external safety on some of these. Believe it or not, guys, Glocks don't have external safeties. Never have. And there's a reason for that. I mean, they're one of the most popular firearms in the world, and there's no external safety. As we said last week, the biggest safety, don't put your finger in the trigger. The gun will not go off if your finger is not in the trigger. That's how it is. It's cut and dry. So let's talk about, let's say you're still a little bit apprehensive about that. There are certainly many firearms out there, Smith & Wesson, SIG, Walther, Ruger. I mean, there's a lot that still offer that ability to have an external safety. One of the things I like, and I know we talked about this one last week, and this is just a great all-around gun for the price and for some of the features. Ruger has come out with something called the SR9 series. Neat thing about this is that, let's see if we can, it does have that external safety. So if that's something that is important to you, it's right there. It's very visible. Obviously, the red is it's on fire, and you can actuate it actually on either both sides, so it's ambidextrous too. The neat thing about this one is it also provides you with something that I'm a big proponent of. It is a loaded chamber indicator. And as we talked about last week, some of the things that can get people into trouble with a semi-auto, if you're not used to it, is when you put a round in here, and we'll use dummy rounds today. When you put a round into that chamber, firearms such as these provide you with what they call a loaded chamber indicator. So at a very quick glance, you can tell that there is a round in this chamber. That's something that gets people in trouble. If a lot of times people will drop the magazine and they'll think that, hey, this firearm is safe, and that firearm will still fire with that round in there. So it is something that, to make this safe, you need to always be aware if there's a round in the chamber. And, to safely clear that, you're pulling back the slide, you're visually looking, you're letting your buddy visually look to make sure that there's nothing in there. Another feature that I really like about the Ruger series. Now, some of the other ones, they do have a loaded chamber indicator, but it's a little more subtle. So if you look at the Smith & Wesson here, theirs is actually a little hole in the top that you can look down there and visually see that there's a round in there. So it's not as prominent as the Ruger, but it's still there, and it's still a great tool to use to see if there's a round in the chamber. Any questions there, Dee?
Open the range.
Well, it's funny you should say that. We are starting to get a plan together for opening it. Tentatively right now, Cinco de Mayo is the day. I know it's going to be our Corona opening. See, you thought you were the only marketing person around here. But we're tentatively thinking about opening it on the 5th of May in some capacity. So hopefully classes will start to come thereafter. What else, Denise? Anything?
I will say with safeties, and I get this question a lot through emails, is do I need a safety? If you think that you need a safety, I would definitely consider obviously having it, especially if you have children. If it's for your peace of mind, I would say do it. As for me, I am not a big fan of safeties. I am the worst person when it comes to multitasking. It's just not me. It's not who I am. And I don't have kids. I don't have anything that I have to be worried about coming into my house, anything like that.
Well, and it's like if you look at the professionals, and the professionals are the law enforcement, it's the military, they don't have safeties. Well, I shouldn't say the military actually does, but the law enforcement guys who carry the gun every day, they don't have a safety, and there's a reason for that. When you present that firearm, you want it to work right now. You want to take everything out of the mix that could cause that to not work at that time, and you have to train with it. I mean, and it's okay. I mean, the 1911 guys, and it's a whole different topic, but the 1911 guys, they train with, as soon as they draw that firearm, taking the safety off. And you can do that, and you can do that successfully. You just have to be committed to that. You have to be committed to going to the range and to knowing that every time I draw that firearm, that the first thing I do is take the safety off, and that's okay. But
if you think you need a safety, then there's no reason to not have a safety, in my opinion. If you feel more comfortable, then absolutely go for it. It's not going to make you any less experienced shooter than the next guy shooting without a safety.
Right. So I'm going to put you on the spot, D. We didn't practice this. It's not in the script and stuff.
No.
So something that, and you being a younger shooter, newer to the market and stuff, hadn't seen the history on this, but it's come up and it's been popular lately. Talk about a grip safety. What does a grip safety get for you?
So,
and what firearms now have that are enormously popular?
There's a few out there. The main one that I definitely know of and have sold numerous times is the Smith & Wesson Easy Shield. So a grip safety, it's pretty much a safety that is on the back of a grip, and you physically have to pretty much not squeeze it, but your hand has to have pressure on it, and that's the only way that the gun is going to go off if your hand is all the way around it, holding it, and you're pulling the trigger. If you're limp wristing or anything like that, your gun's not going to go off. It's not going to do anything.
Right. So it's good and it's bad. I mean, it could be there for you. If you have children in the house, it's not a bad thing because the gun's not going to go off. Even if you have your finger in the trigger of those firearms, it's not going to go off until you depress that safety on the grip, hence the grip safety. And that's not a new concept. It's been around. I mean, Smith & Wesson, I think, came up with it in the 30s or 40s. Springfield.
Majority of theirs has it, yeah.
Yeah, majority of theirs have it. There's good and bad with it, just like anything else. Again, it's a part of it's a mechanical feature. For me personally, on some of the Springfields, I'm not a big fan of it because when we're doing training with law enforcement and stuff, we train using non-dominant hands sometimes. And some of those larger guns with the grip safety, I can get a good grip on that firearm and feel like I'm good to go, but I haven't depressed the grip safety. And that's not what I want in a time of need to be worrying about, have I hit it? The Smith & Wesson shields do a great job of it. It is hard to pick up that firearm in a true fashion with your grip and not depress it. So it does what it's meant to do.
It definitely teaches people to actually not limp wrist and grab
You're exactly
their gun,
right.
Have good grips on that.
Right. Some of the other things you'll see, and this is, I think Glock is what made this probably popular initially, but the safety on the trigger, and again, it allows for an extra layer of protection that, and I don't know if it can be visible here on the screen, but on these triggers, and this one happens to be the Ruger and stuff, this trigger cannot be depressed unless the middle part of it is depressed. So the intent here is that as you're reholstering it, if something gets caught in there and it just barely catches it, the gun is not gonna go off unless it's more of an intentional act. That's a good thing. I mean, with the semi-autos of today, with these striker fires, it does not take much to fire the gun, and if that prevents the gun from going off in a case where you're just reholstering it and something got caught in there, then that's not a bad thing. All these modern firearms have internal safeties. They all have drop test safeties, so you don't have to worry. I mean, it is a rarity that the firearm is going to go off by dropping it. And, you certainly don't want to. You don't want to make a habit of it, but all of these manufacturers do have internal mechanisms to prevent that now. So one other safety too, we talked about it last week, but it is one, and you mentioned the show, which I did catch some of that last week.
Did you see
Wait,
that clip
I can't unsee that. I wasted a whole hour.
It's the Tiger Show, if anybody's wondering.
Yeah, it's not worth your time. But it is in that they talked about the magazine disconnect, and this is something that's important. I would say the vast majority of the firearms that we sell, the modern firearms out there, will fire even though the magazine's not in there. And where this comes into play again is if you have a round, again, a dummy round, if you have a round in that chamber and you drop the magazine out, sometimes the people new to the industry, new to shooting, thinks that gun is safe, where there is a round in that chamber. Most of these firearms will still fire, and that's where people get in trouble. There is some out there. Smith & Wesson is known for being able to have a choice of that you can get something called a magazine disconnect. And that basically means as soon as that magazine drops out of the gun won't fire. It's a safety feature. I can argue both ways on it. I mean, it is it's such that, you know, the whole intent was if you were having a struggle for your firearm, and if you could just drop the magazine, if the bad guy got the gun, then they couldn't fire and cause you harm. There's just as much of an argument the other way too. If you're in that struggle and your magazine gets dislodged and you have one chance to use it, you know, it won't be there for you. So it's an argument that can go either way, but you assume all these firearms that can be fired with the magazine out. You just have to assume that.
Mm-hmm.
What else, Dee? What other questions you got there?
They're saying no sound again. I don't know if you guys can hear us. Before. I still.
Yep. Yeah, it looks like there's still sound.
Your volume this time, I didn't do it.
Here, put your mic up there, Dee. There you go.
What
other questions you got?
We did talk briefly about the left-handed shooters. Let's talk about.
So left-handed shooters too. I mean, just looking, there's a few firearms that cater to to left-handed shooters. Mainly, when you're talking about that, you're talking about the the slide release, and the safeties being on both sides, ambidextrous. FN does a phenomenal job with that. I think all their FN 509 series are ambidextrous, both on the magazine. Release and the slide release. A lot of them will come out there though. I mean, even this inexpensive Ruger has the mag release on both sides now. So a lot of them have really come to the table. It's not nearly as bad as it used to be for left-handed shooters.
H&K is one of
them. H&K, yep.
Glock, their Gen 5s are a lot of theirs are ambidextrous, other than like having a manual safety, and Walthers too.
Yeah, and a lot of those, like on the Glock, if it doesn't have on the mag release, if it doesn't have it on both sides, it can be switched very easily by the gunsmith. So, yep.
What is a good revolver for a woman that would be over the age of 60 that does not have a lot of strength in wrists and can't pull back on a slide?
Yeah, great question. Actually, we talked about it briefly. Not a revolver, but the Smith & Wesson EZ series were created to address just that. The EZ 380, the pulling back on the slide, ma'am. If you haven't tried it, it is so easy. If you still, I mean, if a revolver is still the way to go, I hear you. Still one of my favorite things to carry. There is certainly. I am partial to Smith & Wesson. There are numerous models out there, and the neat thing about that is we can do things to the trigger by putting trigger kits in there that really make it a smooth trigger pull. So you don't have to struggle with that, and you'll have 5 shots, if not 6 shots, of a valid going to be there for you every time. So they cost a hair more, and you're not going to go wrong with Ruger as well. Outside of that, honestly, I mean, Colt has come back in the market with revolvers and stuff. I'd stick with Smith & Wesson and Ruger. Smith & Wesson is just tried and true. So is Ruger. But there is, if you come in and we laid out a couple for you, get a good grip. Now, the one thing, and this is where that recoil comes into play, is typically the revolvers are in 38 special. There's a little recoil to it. If you're not going to carry this outside of your home, if it's going to be a home firearm, go for a little longer barrel. Go for a gun that's steel. You don't have to get an air weight. An air weight, while great for carrying, it's a little bit harder to shoot just because it's so lightweight. So if you get a traditional Smith & Wesson Model 10, Paul's favorite gun.
Great gun.
Oh, you have one too now, don't you? Yeah. If you get a Smith & Wesson Model 10, you will certainly be able to handle it. And those are just so smooth in the trigger pull, and they're so effective, and you'll do well with it. We might even have a used one.
I think so.
Oh, do we still have a used one? Yeah.
I believe so. How can I practice with the range being closed? I think this goes back to the dry firing with snap caps at the moment.
Right, and that's a tough thing. I mean, really, we're struggling with it because we have so many new shooters in our forte. Man, we want to train people. We want people to do the right thing and to carry the message that we send all the time about being safe, responsible firearms owners. We want you to be educated on that, and without having the range right there, that makes it tough. In a couple of weeks, we're gonna start to get back into that. If it is at home, though, come buy a pack of snap caps from us, or the dummy rounds. They're great to get you experience on loading it. We also have loaders as well if that's something that you struggle with, but it gives you experience on loading it. what it looks like when it's in the chamber, getting the trigger, the feel of the trigger. I mean, all that stuff. The more you manipulate the firearm, you become used to it, the less scared you're going to be with it. And when you get to the range, I mean, it's second nature to us now. I mean, people who aren't in the firearms industry, they look at us and they're like, oh, geez, look at him handling them. But we do it day in and day out, and you become very comfortable with it. You can't become complacent, but you can become comfortable with it.
Definitely. Talk about some home defensive ammo. What's your favorite home defense ammo?
You know what? At the end of the day, you certainly want hollow points. I mean, so that right off the bat, make sure it's a hollow point of whatever brand you're choosing. At the end of the day, shot placement trumps any of the newfangled ammo. So that is something that gets back to the practice, but that will trump anything about one brand versus the other. I will say this, and we've talked about this on the show, numerous times. If you get out there on the internet like we all do, and you start reading about what's the latest, greatest ammunition, and there's all kinds of boutique ammo out there, ones that are on the phrase, or they have all kinds of fancy names. The one thing that we contend is to stay with a tried and true brand and model. Stay with what your local law enforcement is carrying. You don't want to carry something that is not what your local law enforcement carries. If you're in a shooting scenario, you want to be able to say that I was carrying what my law enforcement carries. They're the ones who carry it every day for their life. So it stands to reason that they've done the research and that they're carrying something that they know is going to work. If you're carrying a round that's called RIP or Dead Right There, if you have to use that and you're standing up there in front of the jury and they're saying, ma'am, sir, wow, it seems to us you were looking for a fight because you're carrying rounds that say Dead Right There. Man, you were looking to kill someone, weren't you? I mean, isn't that what you were looking to do? When in actuality, you were just looking to stop someone's action to protect your family. So we're real big on sticking with the Federal HST, the Spear Gold Dot, the Hornady line. You can't go wrong with any of those. And we could talk up, any of those. They all perform extremely well, and they're all about the same price. So any of those would be great.
Perfect. All right, give me 1 second. I think we had another question. Getting a lot of questions today. This is good. Any recommendations for 5.56 caliber?
For the gun itself?
For the gun itself. So this person is familiar with handguns and shotguns, but not so much for AR-style rifles. So you do have your AR pistols. You do have your AR rifles.
Dee, you've been getting into this more. I mean, what do you, what is your...
Starting another build. I mean, you definitely have a ton of manufacturers out there. Obviously, like we've been saying, stick to the manufacturers that are well known, like a Smith & Wesson. Those are great starters for if you're just getting into an AR-15. The Smith & Wesson M&P Sport 2s are phenomenal. There's different ones that have like different handguards. If you want M-Log, Key-Mod, if you want a flat top rail, if you want to put a lot of optics under. There's so many different manufacturers out there. SIG makes a real nice one. The treads are super nice.
And the thing is, it can be all different prices. You don't have to spend $1,000 like you used to. Now, I will say, you mentioned builds.
Yeah.
And a lot of people like
so fun to do.
Exactly, they are. They're fun to do. It's kind of neat to be able to put something together and have it work in such a way. One thing to consider though is that when you do a build, if you ever get to a point where you're trading that gun in, that you will get less for that, just because we as a store can't resell it for nearly as much as we could with a firearm that had that came from a manufacturer with a manufacturer's warranty to it. So just keep in mind, I mean, sometimes we'll get someone to come in and they'll say, geez, I have $2,000 in this build. What will you give me for it? And then they're heartbroken to find out we're only going to give them $400 or $500 just because we can't, put yourself on the other side of the counter and you're buying a build now that you don't know, the origin of it and so forth. So that's just something to consider. But really, it's like anything else. Come up with the price range you want to stay within. and stop by here, shoot D an email, and we can start to point you in the right direction. There's so many great options out there right now.
And you get to know your firearm if you really built it yourself. You know all the little tiny D10 pins and everything.
Well, and it's true. I mean, you become an expert. I mean, geez, D, you can take some of these ARs apart now and rebuild them yourself, and that's great. It's great to know then if something happens, you know how to handle it.
Oh, yeah. Recommended light for your everyday carry or house gun. I'm a big fan of the stream lights. I have the TLR HL.
One of the most popular ones out there. And it comes down to personal preference. One of the things I look for in the light, I have kind of a light issue in that I want it bright, and so as time goes on, they get smaller and brighter. The TLR series has been phenomenal. You can't go wrong with Surefire, with Streamlight. There's some other brands out there that are pretty decent now too. The one thing I will consider, it's a lot easier if you're doing this and it's a home gun. It's just going in a nightstand. If you're going to carry this at some point, you start to run into a little bit of an issue when you're looking for holsters for it, and that's the thing that we'll have people come in and they're like, hey, I'm looking for a holster, and we have a ton of holsters here, but I'm looking for a holster for this firearm and this light that I've never heard of, and you'll struggle with the holster. You'll have to have one custom made just because it's so hard when you bring that component into it, and there's so many different combinations. We carry the holster for let's say for a Smith & Wesson M&P, but if you imagine all the different light options that are out there for it and laser options for it, it's just exponential on the amount of holsters you would have to carry in order to handle every scenario.
Absolutely. I think that's all the questions that we.
That it? Any questions you had this week, Dee, throughout from the emails? I mean, I know we had a lot of questions on first firearm purchases. That's kind of what.
I've just been getting asked like my recommendations, and I mean I have my personal top 5 when it comes to concealed carry and home defense. I mean they're not obviously going to be the same when you're looking at concealed carry. I started out carrying a Glock 19, and everybody either asked if I was a guy or if I was pregnant. So it's like you got to find something that you're going to be able to conceal, and it's going to be easy for you to grip and shoot and make sure you're accurate with.
And that's something too. We're getting a lot of questions too. A lot of the new buyers are not looking for concealed carry, or it's down the road for them. Unfortunately, when you get into this industry, you'll be like the rest of us. You'll end up with a drawer full of holsters. You'll end up with multiple firearms at times, and it's hard to find that one that's going to do everything for you. You'll end up with your firearm that you put on when you're out walking the dog, and then the one that in the winter time where you can conceal better, you can go a little bit bigger. It's hard to find that one that's going to do everything. I know I harp on it a lot, and believe it or not, we don't get any kickback from Ruger on this, but like the SR9 is great because on this you can put in the small magazine and have a very concealable gun. But if you're going to the range, you can put the larger magazine in there, have a more full feel. So there is some out there like that. Glock does it, Smith & Wesson does it, but it kind of bridges that gap between a couple different scenarios. So, guys, I guess that's it for the week. We'll probably try to come back next week. What we're going to do, we'll try to put out there early on what we're going to talk about. Obviously, any questions are fair game. But this week we had a lot of questions on first-time purchasers of semi-autos for home. And then maybe next week we'll hone in on shotguns or some other aspect. But if you keep your questions coming, and we certainly want to help, and we cannot wait until that range is open.
I have an idea. We do a Q&A next time. People ask the questions.
Okay. Then we have to think about it right then.
Yeah.
We don't have time to prepare.
On the spot question.
So, well, thanks for jumping in on with us again. Certainly shoot us an email on our website, lepd.com. The top right corner says COVID update. That is where to go to see any change in hours. When you click on that, too, it lists, Denisa puts out there every week, or actually almost daily, our current list of firearms. So if you see something out there you want, you can't get here for a couple of days, shoot us an email within that same page, and we'll pull it for you, set it aside so it's here once you get here, because I know the inventory right now is kind of up and down. We still have a ton of ammo. I mean, if you need any of the major calibers, we're still limiting the quantities you can buy at the moment just because we're not sure what's coming down the pipeline. But at the moment, we have plenty, and we're open Tuesday through Saturday, 11 until 4 right now.
We look forward to seeing you guys.
Yep. Thanks, guys, and have a good week. Stay healthy and stay safe. We'll see you next week.